We're discussing a very important topic tonight. Session 5 in our Adverse Childhood Experiences Growing Up ACEs series is focused on racism, and we'll hopefully get a little bit of insight into understanding the title, which is Racism, the New but Old ACE. And my name is Jessica Canton. In my day job, I'm the CEO of YWCA New Hampshire, and I'm also a trainer and facilitator around topics related to childhood trauma, ACEs, and early care and education. And I'm a survivor of childhood trauma, so that's how I show up in this space. I'm joined tonight for a little bit, as I mentioned, by a special guest, who's Emerald Anderson Ford, who is the YW's new Chief Diversity Officer. And I've invited her here to just, after we get reacquainted with ACEs as a construct, to share a little bit about her path, some of the journey that she's walking, and how she shows up in this work. What I am noticing is that we're a smaller group, which is good because it will invite discussion, but I do have to give, kind of I have to share that this work and these topics show up differently for everyone, and these discussions are not easily had. And so just make sure you're taking care of yourself, as I say at the beginning of all of these discussions on childhood trauma and ACEs, that it's important to show up how you want to be seen, but also respecting the space that you're occupying. And that includes taking care of yourself and knowing your limitations. So with that said, you may hear things tonight that you've never heard before in terms of terminology and concepts. And you may hear things that you've heard before, but have had a reaction to it, whether it be positive or negatively. So let's just all honor to show up how we are this evening. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And my Mac is going to take a while to load the application, like it always does. And I think if I double click it, it'll move faster. All right, so let's reconnect with ACEs through this short video from Number Story. And if you were with us on the last session, we became more acquainted with yournumberstory.org in viewing the individual experiences of childhood trauma survivors.
Let's start here. The story of your number is the story of your ACE history, a score used to measure the number of adverse childhood experiences that happened to you before the age of 18. ACEs fall into 3 categories: abuse, neglect, and household challenges, and are so common that 2/3 of us have at least one. A landmark study found the higher the number, the more likely one can experience negative health effects like heart disease, diabetes, depression, stroke, and asthma. The number is connected to an increased probability of lots of bad stuff. But you are not a number. The number is simply an entry point to your own personal story. Where it leads is up to you. ACEs are not your fault. They happen to us, but they don't need to define us. No person with a 2 is the same as another person with a 2. Each 7 is different from every other 7. Each of us is a unique story, and we each have the power to determine how our own story turns out. Explore the story of your number. Understand how it impacts the children in your life, and take control of where your story leads.
So I think, to build on what we'll be discussing about tonight, we are all more than our number, and sometimes societal constructs, systemic oppression, um, how systems are set up in communities can impact us in a way where there can be we can be more vulnerable to more increased adversities with a higher number. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Emerald Anderson Ford. And Emerald is being very gracious because I did not give her a lot of context for our discussion this evening. But Emerald, we've been fairly informal, just really having dialogue and conversations about ACEs and how it shows up. And I know that you've done a lot of research and work in this area and are doing a lot of research and work in this area. So please feel free to share freely with us.
Thank you. You all can hear me? Thumbs up. Thanks, Jess. Thanks for having me here and inviting me into your space. I know that just respecting the sacredness of the space and how you all are able to come together and share your stories and have discussion is really important. So I don't take your vulnerability and your invitation lightly. Like, I really appreciate that. So when Jessica invited me, I initially started to think about how I wanted to show up here and what I might want to share in this space and what that means for the journey that I have been on personally, but also what I'm seeing reflected in people who might look like me, and particularly talking about this idea of racism being kind of the new but old ACE, right? So I'll tell you a really quick story. And Jessica knows this. We actually talked about this, I remember, in my interview process. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. I'm from the South. And my father's side of the family is from this really small town called Spartanburg, South Carolina. And he grew up extremely poor. And he somehow made his way to Atlanta, which from Spartanburg is about 2.5 hours away, and did the things in the 1970s that poor Black men often did in cities. And then he met my mom, who was this city girl, and they fell in love, and I was born. And so I have these two parents who are trying to do the best that they can by this new baby that they have, and a father who did not graduate from high school. And so he did the only thing that he knew how to do in that moment to take care of his wife, his young wife, and his young child. And he robbed some places. He tried to get money the way that he knew how to make sure that we were able to survive. My father was in prison from the time that I was 2 years old until the time that I was 14 years old. And so I grew up, as people often say, in a broken home, although it was full of love and laughter, even if we didn't have a whole lot of anything. And I spent a good portion of my breaks as a child. You have all these like summer breaks and spring breaks. I spent a good portion of my breaks having a mother that was carting me across the country from Atlanta, from the different prisons that my father was sent to make sure that I had a relationship with my dad. And it was in those moments at age 9, 10, 13 that I started to realize what the prison system was, how it operated, who was reflected in it, and oftentimes the situations that folks were in that led them to be in the prison system. And so that's just a part of how race has really impacted my work, not just at the YW, but in life. The way I understand the prison industrial complex is definitely saddled on looking at the reflection of how Black men in particularly are disproportionately represented in that system. I also had the misfortune of having a brother who found himself in juvenile detention centers growing up and is now currently incarcerated. move a little bit further, I met my partner, and I come to learn, and he is a Black man from the South, from Richmond, Virginia, about his story as well as we were getting to know each other, and about his mother having multiple children, being a single mom, and how he grew up homeless, living out of cars, living out of motels, unsheltered for about 11 years of his life. And I started to put together, there is something systemically wrong in our country. And race is playing a really key part in some of these adverse experiences that folks are having. And I started to think through, who are our children who are experiencing being unhoused? Who are our people who are experiencing incarceration? Again, what are the situations that are leading them to this point? And I recognized that race was being used, whether intentionally or unintentionally, as a way to continue to embed trauma into generations of people. And over the course of many years, that has led me to the YW, just having that understanding, starting to think through and pull apart those like very carefully like tied knots and threads of internalized oppression that can lead folks who identify as people of color down a road that inevitably has an adverse effect on their life trajectory. And so that's what I'm always thinking about. And I'm always thinking about how I got here and how that led me here. And I count myself lucky that even through that experience, I am who I am, and I'm able to do the work that I'm able to do. But I recognize that that's not everybody. And I recognize that there is so much room for us as a collective to do better and to think more intentionally about how these different parts of our identity intersect and impact our experiences as children and as young adults. And I oftentimes wonder if, even my mom, who did the very best she could, I oftentimes wonder if she was able to pinpoint and like have a conversation with me about race early on, about what it meant to be Black in the South, about the options or lack thereof that my dad had, that she had, if it would have made a difference in how she was able to think about what her next step was. I don't think she was able to pinpoint that at the time. And that had an impact on me inevitably. So that's just how I come to this work. That's a very just honest way that I look at it. That's a very honest way that I had an entry point into understanding the carceral system and race, how I understand, again, ACEs in race, how I understand what it means for us to support and elevate the needs of our young people, our kids and our students, and recognizing that if we are not being intentional about talking about race, then we are not being intentional about pinpointing all of the points of trauma and traumatic and adverse experiences that our young people are having. So that's where I am.
Thank you, Emerald. Does anyone have any questions for Emerald or? The gratitude coming through in the chat box. I know it's been a long day. So Emerald, I would ask, like, out of all the community work that you've done, what do you think the community needs? Because we're going to be talking tonight about like what we can do at community level, systemic level. Like, what do you think the community needs to really wrap our arms around how this ACEs and racism intersect so vastly?
Yep. Yeah. I'd say there has to be a boldness in conversation. Like, we're sitting here and you all, you do this regularly and you're able to have really tough conversations. And I'm not asking you to share your story with the whole community, but what I am thinking is that it might be a boldness in saying, we actually have to be intentional about talking about some of these adverse experiences that our BIPOC children are having, our children of color are having. when we have to be bold in that, and we have to be, we it's nuanced because we want to be able to push ourselves while also caring for ourselves, and recognizing that community care and being bold in that is also caring for ourselves. So that's one thing. I see people shy away from conversations about wanting to understand that there is inevitably an intersection between race and childhood trauma. And people don't want to go there. People want to try to parse this out to be something else. Oh, it's this. Oh, it's something else. And they don't ever want to say there are systems that have been set up over many years by no fault of anybody in this room or any room currently right now in the world, but have been set up over decades and centuries that have been predicated on race and that have led to generational trauma and adverse experiences. No, it's really hard to get into rooms, especially, and I'm going to name a thing, especially in a room full of white people. They don't want to have that conversation. I think that's one of the best ways we can do that, is just to be bold as we can be while caring for ourselves and pushing those conversations forward.
I agree with you in terms of being bold. And so what we'll be doing tonight is watching some videos, sharing some information. I'm asking you tonight to do sort of your own self-guided reflection on the work. I'm one of those people that when I'm processing in real time, but in honoring that not everybody processes in real time, we won't really have the opportunity tonight for some of the forced reflection and dialogue that you might find in me having in other spaces with you all, but we will certainly pause for questions, comments. Dave is on. He will be monitoring the hands up emoji you can use at the bottom of your screen. He'll be putting things into the chat. And Emerald, I just want to thank you for joining us for this part of our journey. And I think the YW, I may be partial, is, this is just really the beginning of the work that we are going to be all collectively doing together. And so there may be more opportunities for you all. I would encourage you to follow us on our social media, get on our mailing list in terms of email, follow the website to look for more opportunities to engage. This is a space that you're hoping to explore a little bit further.
Yep. And I just popped my email in the chat. I'm available if you have questions about anything, if you want to just kind of talk a little bit about understanding race dynamics, understanding what racism, the history of racism here. And if you feel like there's a question that like you feel uncomfortable asking somebody else, you can always ask me. I'm going to hold you with love, as I try to do with everybody in these moments and in these conversations. So please feel free just to send me an email. Let me know if you have any questions. And I do hope that I get to engage with you all again. Maybe possibly back here, but definitely maybe with some events and organizing at the YW. So thank you for again inviting me into your space. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, I think Emerald, it would be great to have you come back next time. You and I can chat offline about what that might look like.
Yep, that'd be great.
So
I'm gonna hop off now. Yep, thank you.
Thank you. All right, so I'm gonna go back to sharing my screen. So get us into what we'll be discussing this evening is understanding racial trauma. We're going to look at exploring the generational implications, understanding the risk factors, and identify opportunities for healing and growing in experiences. So in preparing for tonight's session, I really did a lot of research from multiple sources and listened to webinars, drew from my own research on ACEs. And racism is a word that, if we were in a room and I asked you, write down what your definition of racism is, we might all come up with different definitions, but we might, there would probably be similarities across the board. And I found this definition, I was listening to a panel discussion on ACEs for child health professionals. And this quote was shared from Dr. Kamara Jones. And she says, I define racism as a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on the social interpretation of how one looks, which is what we call race. That unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities and saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. And, I think given the context of our discussions this evening, I think this is a really appropriate and relevant explanation of racism, because we're talking about racism and how it shows up in early childhood, in early development, and how that shapes the trajectory of development across the lifespan. And essentially, how structures and systems in our communities, in our country, in our world, really bypass extreme human talent just based simply on structural concepts alone and oppressive systems, and the inability to look at things through both an equity and an equality lens. So I want to share this video from you with all of you on racial trauma.
My father's early experience of, basically watching his parents die because they were not allowed to go to the hospital because there were no hospitals for Black people. The trauma from that, my father being left an orphan with his younger brother, had a huge impact on him and then consequently on me. That was one of the earliest experiences connected to my father. The next would be my experience of being a part of the Operation Exodus program and being bused. There were only 20 of us that went to this particular school. Being in a Black community, and then suddenly you're plucked out of that and you're on this yellow bus and it rocks up to this school where everybody in the school is white. And suddenly I became an other. And so I was often accused of cheating. I was often shamed in front of the class. I experienced just repeated incidents, and my sister, who's a couple of years older than me, experienced even more. My brother, Saladin, was assigned to Hyde Park High. There were everyday protests and people, white folk, men, women, children, standing along the side of the road, swearing, throwing rocks, and the kids having to go through that every single day was extremely traumatizing for them. My sister-in-law tells the story of being on the bus and sitting next to a girl when a brick came through the window, and the glass hit the girl in the eye, and there was a real fear as blood streaming down. She's traumatized watching this. That was the kind of thing that the students faced every day on their way to school and coming back home. So there were white students who were actually attending the school. They did come to school, and there were constant fights that would erupt, and the police would have to be called in. It was chaos in the schools. And in other communities like South Boston, where early on, like the white students just refused to go to school. Charlestown was the same thing. Those kind of things really affect like one's perceptions of self, of other. Am I able to trust white people? We're talking in the 70s, and now we fast forward, it's 2019. And what are the ways in which things have changed, and what are the ways in which things are still the same? In some cases, it's not a brick and it's not a rock, but it's a word. Anyone who's lived long enough, we've heard that before. We've seen it, we've experienced it. The more things change, the more they stay the same, and that's sad. And it's sad when it's not just in the world, but when it's in the church. I came away with a sense of racial trauma, of not feeling secure about who I was as a Black girl. Did I actually have a hope and a future? Those things are in question. And so in that school environment, I learned that there was something inherently wrong with me, and no amount of whatever, education, et cetera, was going to fix it.
So some of you that have been with me throughout this journey of deepening our understanding of ACEs. Hold on. You probably can't see it, but you all are like in the middle of my screen. Give me 1 second there. That's better. Know that stories is a huge component of telling, illustrating the pictures, illustrating the key takeaways, right? And so I had limited exposure to this concept of racial trauma and thought it important for us to define it. What is racial trauma? Racial trauma is a result of ongoing exposure to racial stressors such as racism, racist bias, discrimination, violence against people of color, and racist abuse in the media that creates an environment in which a person of color feels unsafe simply because the color of their skin. It is widespread among all marginalized or stigmatized racial or ethnic groups. So I've been leading conversations, researching trauma for years, and in all of that exposure and creating trauma-informed communities, understanding the many different types of trauma that I've shared with all of you, racial trauma never really came up. And so that in and of itself is why it's so important to have these conversations, to be able to unpack the language and be able to understand how this shows up in communities. So what are some triggers which contribute to racial trauma? Prolonged exposure to racist abuse or discrimination, whether that be implicit or explicit, and that is all encompassing. And many of the terms that we'll be discussing this evening are standalone trainings and sessions on their own. So when I say, like, if you have an interest in exploring this further, I would really encourage you to seek out professional development opportunities, because there's such a wealth of information out there about from a research perspective, from an anecdotal perspective, about all of these concepts. Media depictions of racism, dismissal and denial. You know, I was meeting with my team this morning at work, and we were talking about some communication strategies around our diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And we were discussing the evolution of how racism has been depicted over time, you know, in TVs and multimedia, and how it is at times is almost acceptable behavior. We call these microaggressions, you know, where they're not overtly, I'm not being racist, I'm just trying to be humorous, or just that dismissal and denial, and excuses are made about why these things are socially acceptable to be included. Exposure to stereotypes, so systemic issues, right? Our last video, the woman was sharing how when she was a little girl, just based solely on the environmental situation of busing, none of which those children had any responsibility for. The adults in their communities, the white adults in their communities, made those decisions, you know, were consequenced for it. And her character as a person, as a student, was called into question simply because she looked different than her classmates. Dismissal and denial that racism exists, you know, like I grew up with a lot of, well, that doesn't happen anymore, or, you know, any number of the different excuses that we might hear around, you know, how racism pretty much died with slavery, or pretty much died with the freedom movement. And, you know, and the reality is those things are not true. We know, based on research, based on science, that it's still existing to this day, and that we still have a lot of work ahead of us. So what we do know is that despite clear evidence acknowledging racism as a major life stressor for Black youth, theoretical models of early childhood adversity have largely neglected the multifaceted influence of racism on mental health outcomes. So you're like, that's a lot of clinical knowledge. And normally I wouldn't share this kind of a quote, because it really speaks more to the inner nerd in me of liking these researching clinical terms. But if we just distill this down to what it means, is that we've ignored the fact that racism is a major life stressor for the most part for the Black children and youth in our communities. We know, science tells us, the ACEs study tells us that early childhood adversity has an impact on the developing child. But we've neglected to include racism in that conversation. And we've neglected to include how racism impacts overall mental health for children across the lifespan. And not just in mental health, but also physical health. We'll learn tonight about how, just like all the other ACEs that we discuss, racism has implications for the health of a community, for the health of children and families. So I always feel like in order to name something, you have to understand its origins and how it's designed. How does it still live and breathe in our community and in our world? I would say the first is power, right? We give it power, we give it fuel. And I'm saying we in the sense of society, communities, the world, right? Us that have privilege, white people that have privilege, right? We give it power by not showing up as good allies, by not showing up as good bystanders in discussions that allow systemic racism and racism to flourish. We hoard resources, whether consciously or subconsciously, because that is how the system has been set up and designed for us. But it's also how racism lives. Privileges, not something that a lot of people understand. I have people in my life that are like, what do you mean I'm privileged? I grew up poor, I grew up this, I grew up that. And certainly economically disadvantaged individuals, that also is a measure of groups or populations that are generally oppressed and in communities. But white privilege in and of itself means that you have privilege simply because of the color of your skin. It means that the system is designed with you in mind, right? And so we'll talk about equity and equality in a little bit. And there's influencers, major influencers that keep the system going, right? We don't want to dig in and do this deep work because it's difficult. And we would have to really get at the core of why it is allowed and continues. And then the systems of power and oppression, which design racism, would have to be dismantled. Just like other systems that we know in our country are defaulted or at fault, but we keep building upon them rather than dismantling them. And I, Jessica Canton, don't have all the answers to how this would occur, but I would like to think that at the core of it is humanity. So how can we show up as humans in our community for our children and see them beyond all of these factors, but recognize that these factors are impacting their human experience? And essentially, is the girl holding the picture, the sign in the picture says, like, racism is a pandemic too. Imagine, if you will, for a moment, that we took on this, considering racism to be a public health threat the way we consider childhood cancer to be a public health threat, or COVID-19 to be a public health threat, or childhood obesity to be a public health threat. Those are very comfortable diseases to talk about because those aren't directly related to you as a human being having poor judgment or questionable values. These other things that we allow to foster and continue get to humanity, they get to the core of ourselves. And I think until we're able, as Emerald said, to have those powerful and bold conversations, then we are continually going to be in a cycle where our Black and brown children are more susceptible to collecting adverse childhood experiences than our white children. So what I like about adverse childhood experiences is that, it kind of sounds weird though, like what I like about adverse childhood experiences. What I mean is what I enjoy about the study and what the study has taught us is that essentially it's a frame for understanding how we can understand the human experience, right? Through the social factors related to humanity, through the historical origins of the family that allowed an environment where ACEs could thrive and live. And then what are the biological implications for that? You know, there are children that based on their ACEs score alone are more susceptible to things like childhood cancer, you know, kidney failure, significant diseases that we typically see later in life, but because of their exposure to ACEs, and the toxic stress they've been exposed to from a young age, that just breaks it down even further for them. So if we start with this notion, and some of you might have heard me talk about this before, that parents are the first teacher, right? Then we invite a conversation around, you know, generational trauma, generational poverty, right? And I came across this term too of racial socialization. Racial socialization is the ways in which parents teach their children how to navigate the often contradictory messages or teach them what it means to be a person of color is called racial socialization. And so I was like, wow, I'm like, racial socialization could be its own standalone training, webinar, lecture. But what we've had to create a term for parents of BIPOC children and youth to be able to teach their children to navigate a world that isn't set up for them. Much like I had to, well, not much like, I'm not trying to compare the experiences, but when I go to my mind for me as a parent is having my child who has ADHD and oppositional defiant disorder and having to help him to navigate a school and educational program that was not set up or conducive to him being successful in learning. And again, not comparing the experiences, but if I could give you sort of an idea, if you ever have had to support or advocate for a child who has disabilities in a community or school system, then I could maybe give you a inch of what it must feel like to have to racially socialize your children, and compound that with, there is a real fear that based on other factors within a community, that your child could become a victim of violence, a further traumatized from a number of different factors. So rather than understand this as a really awful human condition, we've had to accept it, not celebrate it, not like it, but we've had to accept it as part of the socialization of BIPOC children and youth, and give it a term. So if I had to offer you some suggestions about what it will take, right, to begin to unpack some of this, because I don't think it's insurmountable, right? I don't know if it will completely come to fruition in my lifetime. I'm hoping in my children's lifetime that we would have made a lot more progress than where we're at right now with regards to racism. Humans can be the worst predators of other humans. And in domestic violence work in particular, we like to talk about, you know, never saying we want to eliminate domestic violence in a community. And you're probably like, whoa, what does that mean? We say that because when we say, you know, that those words can sometimes drive things into the dark more because of the shame and guilt associated with having to deny an experience. So in other words, I think what I'm trying to say is I think we're far, far way out from eliminating racism. And you're like, well, that's in your mission at the OIW. You're right, it is in our mission, because a mission is what you aspire to. A mission is what you hope to achieve. A mission is a reminder of what you should always be putting at the forefront of what you're doing. And so if we're aspiring to address racism in our community, we can start there, right? We're going to start there. We need to think about building equity. We need to create pathways for truth, reconciliation, and healing. And so reconciliation and healing is this is an example of truth, reconciliation, and healing. You're taking time out of your evening to learn more about how racism is an ACE. You're maybe potentially from that experience going to share that education with other people in your circle, in your community, in your professional world. And if we could take that a step further, is how can we create and embed racial justice into our communities across the board? How can we engage in the authentic dialogue that's needed to embed racial justice? And how can we not cherry pick the social justice issues that matter to us and see it all at once? And that requires advocacy. And advocacy isn't about being perfect. Advocacy is about showing up and saying, I see you, I see your experience. And while I may not fully understand it, and it may not be my own, I'm here to support you to be a voice in that experience changing. Or I'm here to support you how you need me to show up. But we have to be careful with that, because for years, what we've done with advocacy in this space as white people, and I'm speaking as a white woman, my experience is we've relied very heavily on our BIPOC communities to tell us what they need from us to heal, to truth reconcile, instead of us listening and pausing and jumping in and not putting it back on the oppressed to fix the oppressor. Your mind might explode. It's a lot to think about, right? That's why I said, I'm not going to make you do any forced dialogue or reflections tonight, but things to think about. These are things I've been thinking about. It's a journey. It's not, I am not at an arrival point by any means. There are many, many years of wiring in my brain through my experiences with my family of origin and my own experiences in the community, my almost 25 years in the field, that have shaped my beliefs and my automatic thoughts. So it's a lot of unpacking and evaluation. And, there are no shortcuts in this work. If you choose to, that's your choice, but there's not going to be any shortcuts in us making a real change. And so if all of that philosophical stuff doesn't really resonate with you, or you're not there yet, and that is completely okay. This is your space and your space alone. I think what might be also important is when we talk about beginning to discuss these issues at community levels, we need to identify different entry points based on the audience that we're speaking to. And if you would have asked me that 6 months ago, a year ago, I'd have been absolutely not. We should not water down anything to make people feel more comfortable. Isn't that part of the problem? And that statement is problematic, right? Because we know that for any real change to happen with an individual, we need to assess our energy level towards the situation. What is that person's readiness to change? What is that person's ability to hear really what I'm saying? And so you have the philosophical approach that we just discussed, right? Some of the historical origins of this that are undeniable. And then there's the science, the health behind it. So health disparities that intersect with ACEs. And when we talk about something intersecting, we mean that, it is often accompanies, like how roads need to intersect so we can get from point A to point B. There are often things that intersect with things like ACEs and trauma and toxic stress and domestic violence which allows it to gain more momentum and strength in a community and results in poorer outcomes. So chronic health disease is one of them. We talked in earlier sessions about humans are literally the only creatures in the world that hold on to trauma and hold on to stress. And certain toxic stress events and trauma events can trigger off genetic markers in us that can create an environment where chronic health disease can occur, whether that be mental health or physical health. It can also result in acute health disease, which can lead to more life-altering things, life-changing things like kidney disease, like cancer, like heart disease. We also have to talk about the health disparities and accessibility issues, right? Oftentimes the communities we're discussing and talking about this evening, because of the lack of access to healthcare, a medical home provider, which is that's somebody that is like your PCP, for example, your primary care physician, that can lead to misdiagnosis. Where they're living in can impact like what are their options for medical services. Finances can impact what is their ability to purchase healthy foods. Oftentimes the communities may be living in a community within our country where there's a food desert. There's not access to healthy foods because there isn't a great transportation system. I know that Manchester, through their American Recovery Act funds, is working with some of the local convenience stores in the city, inner city, to be able to offer more healthy options. And then you also have overburdened health insurance programs. And what I mean is overburdened health insurance programs that are funded through the state and federal government. So they're under-resourced and overburdened in the sense that they're not able to do the job that they need to do to show up for these children that are facing these complex issues around trauma and chronic toxic stress. Wendy asked, does equity have to do with the financial constraints and the ability to pay for services? So equity, in part, yes. So we'll dive a little bit deeper into the difference between equity and equality in a moment. But if we're looking at equity from a financial perspective, we'll just look at wages. You know, we know that people of color in our country make 90 cents to every dollar that white people make. And then if you break that down by gender, it starts to get even a little scarier, right? So that in and of itself is a financial constraint. And so that would then roll over the ability for individuals to be able to access and pay for services. So we're gonna watch a quick video that takes us a little bit further into the definitions of racial trauma.
Racial trauma isn't just something that Black and Brown Americans experience regularly. It's something health experts say they're born into.
What makes it traumatic is how you experience it.
Similar to PTSD, racial trauma or race-based traumatic stress is the collective effect racism has on an individual's mental and physical health. It can be from major experiences like workplace discrimination or hate crimes, or it can be the result of an accumulation of many small indignities called microaggressions, or system or institutions that enforce structural oppression.
There was a national survey done by the American Psychological Association, and about 25% of all African Americans, 30% of all Native Americans report at least one of those experiences at least once a week.
The APA says not only do Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian American people significantly suffer from racial trauma, but that it can also compound with additional oppression based on gender or sexual orientation.
It depends on the intensity and the frequency of how often you experience racism or how severe the event is. But you might start with just race-based stress. So something will be racist and you'll be exposed to it and you'll feel stress. But racial trauma is really when it has those long-term effects. It really sticks with you.
Immediate symptoms can include increased heart rate or blood pressure, heightened cortisol levels, sweating, or tension in the body. Long-term chronic exhaustion and fatigue are among the most common symptoms.
Just sadness, underlying or overt anger, even thinking differently about yourself. So sometimes believing or starting to endorse those stereotypes that people might have about your racial group. If you're experiencing racial trauma, you might have some of that internalized racism.
Increased hypervigilance, the having the nightmares or flashbacks, avoidance of situations where they may perceive it as threatening. All of those are consistent with what we find in race-related stress and PTSD. So there's a lot of overlap.
Kind of, bouncing back and forth between that and none, and never really feeling safe and socially connected and supported. And that also affects your brain and how your brain develops.
America's healthcare system impacts racial trauma too, making it more difficult not only to find help, but someone who understands a patient's experience. A 2015 study found that in the US, 86% of psychologists were white, 5% were Asian, 5% were Hispanic, 4% were Black. Meanwhile, some of the experts we spoke to are setting out to help. Dr. Candace Nicole Hargens released Black Lives Matter meditations for racial trauma victims and white allies.
Black Lives Matter.
Therapist Kelly Baker has helped organize Facebook Live videos with her local NAACP branch where anyone can connect to learn more about racial trauma. She's included sharing her own experiences.
I don't think you can say that there was ever a time for me when I did not, that I was never exposed to racism. When I think about my family, my mom, my grandmother, and the things that my mother experienced that were clearly racist definitely affected how she parented her children.
What can be done to respond to racial trauma? Dr. Erlanger Turner tells Newsy adding an official diagnosis of racial trauma to the DSM-5, an encyclopedia of sorts for mental health professionals, is not the solution. He suggests racial trauma's existence is something everyone should be aware of, especially healthcare providers and policymakers.
If you are white, you do need to make sure that you try to understand that person's experience, that you provide some sense of solidarity, that you don't apologize. I think people oftentimes want to apologize in these situations, and that's really not helpful. We need solutions. And so I think that is one of those things that we have to do better and make sure that we take ownership.
Lindsay Thies, Newsy, Denver.
So I think what I liked about that video is that it broke down racial trauma beyond the storied experience, but it also gave practical solutions for us to think about in how we can address this in our communities. And it also lifted up the fact that, racial trauma has a similar impact that trauma has on the developing brain, and that it can change the neural pathways. And that can really be at any stage of development. But since we are talking about adverse childhood experiences, imagine the experiences of, that child birth to 5 that may be dealing with some of the ACEs we've discussed, parental incarceration, being unhoused, divorce and separation, food insecurity, and how that racism can really compound that in a community system and what they're able to lean into for support. So if we're talking about what's the next step? What does equity mean? How do we make things a little more equitable? We need true systems change. And so as I've already identified, that is going to take some time. It's going to take us dismantling our own systems within our communities to the level at which we can and feel comfortable in this moment and are part of the journey in this work. Understanding equity and equality are not the same thing. And I have a graphic that I'll share with you. cultivating a social justice mindset. People ask me all the time, they're like, what does the YWCA do? What do you stand for? And I go, what do you mean, what do we stand for? Well, what does YWCA mean? I go, well, actually, YWCA isn't an acronym anymore. It used to mean Young Women's Christian Association. Then in 2016, we moved away from that so that we could be more inclusive. And then the Young Women's Christian Association didn't really represent who we were as an organization anymore. And they're like, well, that's odd. That doesn't make sense. So what do you do? And I said, well, we're a social justice organization. Well, like, you can see the wheels start to turn, right? And so cultivating a social justice mindset, I mean, social justice could be one of those bucket words we dump lots of things into: racism, sexism, creating communities free from violence, trauma. We could dump a lot of buckets in there. But when I say that YWCA is a social justice organization, what I mean is we are truly aspiring to be an organization that creates a safe space, is responsive to the needs of our community, advocates for the changes that we're talking about. And we could go on and on and on, but this isn't a training about YWCA. So what at the core of that, though, for using that example, is a commitment to improving health outcomes for everyone in our community. When, I mentioned earlier on that I'm a survivor of childhood trauma. My ACEs score is 9. So there's 10 current ACEs identified. I'm a 9. So I didn't discover the ACEs study until I was in my mid-30s. And had I known that information sooner, that would have helped with parenting some of my older children, right? It would have helped with understanding some of the mental health struggles that I was facing at that time. And so I think that knowledge is power, right? And so if we can show up and begin to have these conversations and talk about it, then that is powerful in of itself. So I've seen lots of different variations of this graphic. I think the more popular one is the one with the apple tree, but I was looking at a few different ones and I really liked this one because it included justice. Because justice, I think, is another one of those words that we throw around a lot, like racial justice and social justice and justice system. And, justice is, is a vehicle for us to create an opportunity where these barriers are removed, the systemic barriers are removed. That's justice, right? So equality, right? We see them all standing on the same box. So in equality, the assumption is that everyone benefits from the same supports. This is equal treatment, right? Fair enough. I think most of us grew up with a focus on equality. Equity is everyone gets the supports they need. This would be the concept of affirmative action, thus producing equity, right? Did affirmative action really produce equity? That's probably an entirely different workshop or community conversation. However, I think in an equity system, everyone gets supports they need. So what that looks like is, the person that is shorter gets an extra box so they can see the game too. In a justice model in a community, we take away that wooden fence, we replace it with a chain link fence, and everyone can see the games without supports or accommodations because the causes of the inequity were addressed, barring any sort of physical disability that any of those folks might have and being able to visually see the game, because that could be another addition onto this. But at the heart of this illustration is demonstrating the system barrier as removed. So equity and equality are not the same thing, and we often will use them interchangeably. So I can't, we talked about the elephant in the room earlier on, or maybe I was listening to someone else talk about that today. And, I always like to point out the disruptors to progress, and part of this is my own reflections on my own experience, diving deeper into this. But, the disruptors to you progressing, as if you are a white person in this space is your shame about how it has shown up in your life or what you may or may not have done up until this point. That's not helpful to anyone, you know. Feel it, name it, and then figure out a way to keep pushing forward towards progress. Fear, am I going to say the wrong thing? Am I going to call someone something in a way that they don't identify with? Or am I going to further fracture the relationship or conversation? Or am I going to upset someone? You have to really unpack that one for yourself and how that shows up in both your professional work and your personal life, and what might be behind that fear. I will tell you this, anyone that I've talked to has always said, just ask. Like, if you don't know how I would choose to identify, whether it be Black American, African American, BIPOC individual, person of color, woman of color, just ask, right? And then there's also this human, I think it's a survival mechanism. It's really this resistance to our own vulnerability and admitting that, you know, there may be things that we have left to work on, and working on them is scary and it's challenging and it's difficult. And I think, you know, I can only speak to my experiences as a white woman. I can't speak to the experiences of everyone. But I think in some varying forms, these show up for everyone in different ways in the conversation on racism. So if I were to give you some guided reflection, and, you know, I'm not going to ask anyone to jump in if you don't want to, but it's just like, let's take like a 30-second pause and think, like, maybe write it down, think it in our mind, make a mental note for later. How can we hold one another accountable in these discussions, right? Because it is going to take accountability. It's going to take bold conversations. And how can we work towards changing our mental frames of reference? You know, and that is maybe some of the origins of the things that we believe. I know where some of my mental frames of reference came from. They came from my family of origin. My family of origin is very racist, you know, and there were a lot of years spent denying that. I'm like, oh, well, it was just how they were raised. No. Even if someone was raised to be racist, that's not an excuse for their behavior, right? Or, oh, they just grew up in different times of what? They're carrying those experiences to now. So we're no longer in different times. So we could dismantle each of those excuses and say how they don't really fit the dialogue that is going to lead us towards productive change. So let's pause for a moment and give you some time to think about that. Well, this day is just flying. Right. Let's see, we have someone in the chat. Lorinda, do you want me to read it, or would you like to share that?
I just said that one way that's helped me is just like looking up, researching stuff, because like everybody has the internet. Most people have the internet. You're on Facebook or whatever, but it's so easy to just do a Google search. And I feel like the more stories I hear of people's lived experiences, it really helps me empathize with them. And then it kind of like, I index it in my mind, like, oh, okay, like this is why we shouldn't be doing this now. Like, this is how it actually affects people when this happens. So just like researching and listening to stories has really been helpful for me.
Thank you, Lorinda.
Yep.
So I think that lends itself, that sharing of stories and listening to stories about, like, well, how can we mitigate the risk involved with, because we talked about this with other adverse childhood experiences, like how could we mitigate the risk? How could we minimize the toxic stress, minimize the impact. And I think again, my frame of reference as a white woman with privilege is building alliances and sharing power, right? Giving space for others in spaces that they typically have been left out of or are not currently included in for any number of different factors, whether intentional or unintentional. Developing an intentionality to not re-traumatize. And so for children, how this shows up is, examining the environment, examining the community. Am I creating a community space where the children aren't going to be re-traumatized by oppressive levers within those systems, right? So whether that be economic or content in a classroom, there's been so many examples that I've learned, like Lorinda, I kind of have been collecting experiences because much like her, I love the stories component of this as a means of for me to be able to deepen my understanding. But a young woman was sharing a story with me of when she was in elementary school. Young Black girl was in elementary school, and she was talking about how the teacher assigned an assignment that led to her classmates assuming that she would know more. It was a unit on slavery, that she would know more simply because of the color of her skin. Now the teacher, whether that intentional or unintentional, was like, well, I'm teaching history right now, right? But without realizing, set up an opportunity for this person to be re-traumatized. And so that's a lot to think about, right? Because it's a mind shift. It's like resetting a lot of our perceptions about how we see the world. Community-based efforts. We can't rely entirely on a government system, a justice system, or a school system to get this work accomplished. We have to look at the community and how the community supports this or doesn't support it. We have to invest in neighborhood strategies, and that's not us applying solutions in a blanket way, but it's us really mobilizing neighborhoods to be able to tell us what their needs are and how we can make changes, and investing resources. And then engaging for prevention, educating parents and educating our students about how we recognize these systems of oppression in our community and how can they carry that forward to the next generation so that, we can begin to dismantle these things that allow these things to live and thrive. So what are some systems of inequality which exist currently in the United States? Residential segregation. So this is, the redlining that began in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, which pushed BIPOC communities out of, certain areas. Housing and shelters, where we've set up communities and systems which discourage or make home ownership unobtainable because of the sheer cost of it. Remember, we talked about the wage disparities and really pushed on this notion of renting where we could keep that imbalance of power going. Food insecurity, right? Income inequality, education inequality. I mean, one of the things we did last summer was we held, youth listening sessions with our Black Lives Matter chapter, and they were the youth students were coming and telling us stories of simply like ways that they had experienced racism and oppression in the school district. This is in our community. This wasn't like another community far, far away from here, right? And I know a lot of the teachers in our community are doing incredibly difficult work, incredibly hard work amidst a pandemic, amidst small resources. But again, if we take away this individual responsibility beyond showing up and being an ally and being authentic and having these conversations, to these are systems that have been built for so long, and we shift that dialogue to how can we dismantle them? How can we gain an understanding of this lived experience so that these things can't continue? That it no longer becomes, well, I'm personally responsible for why this happened, and more around I'm personally responsible for making sure it doesn't continue to happen. Policing and incarceration. Now, this is, one of the hot button issues in our country right now, like that, in terms of the context of ACEs, like how this shows up for ACEs, is parental incarceration is an adverse childhood experience. And when you heard Emerald's sharing her own experiences in the beginning, and for better or for worse, there has been a long history of injustice as it relates to policing in our country. However, we know that policing is a vital part of our community. That, the YW, particularly in the space of our crisis services work, relies very heavily on partnerships with police. And in Manchester in particular, like Manchester Police Department was one of the policing groups that helped us to develop the Adverse Childhood Experiences Response Team, which was like, how do we address adverse childhood experiences in the community? So these bullets are bullets on a screen, but hopefully what I'm highlighting is they're deeper conversations, they're deeper things to unpack. And then environmental injustice, what is the quality of the environment that, that our children are exposed to, that we've been discussing this evening. So switching over, so we just discussed, the disparities and how, and so I want to bring it back over to how these impact child health. So drivers are different than social determinants of health in this space, right? So what we're learning, right, with all these things is that these risk factors compiled make an environment where children may be more susceptible to developing acute, which is ongoing, and I got it reversed, episodic or results in some sort of terminal illness, or chronic, which is ongoing lifespan health issues, right? So this is different than what we know ACEs to just be alone as social determinants of health. And then systemic racism. We've made that argument. I've made that argument tonight. You may be still sitting in it, or you may be like, yeah, I'm there and I was already down the road further than you, right? So we got that one. Toxic stress. So we talked about how these things compound upon one another. And then economic, right? Because can we truly say, well, we have a system of, equality or equity set up for, access to healthcare in our country, and that's true across the board for so many different groups and how they identify. So what are some community-based strategies we can discuss or think about? Investing in grassroots partnerships, time, money, and energy. And I think that is one of the things I've seen through some of the funds that the city of Manchester, where we're located, is getting in the American Recovery Act funds, is investing in those partnerships that represent the communities that they are operating in, empowering communities, again, not offering sweeping solutions. This other thing that I was exposed to early on was like nothing about us without us, right? So not being a group of white people sitting around the table talking about how to address racial injustice in the community or oppression in the community. Becoming trauma informed, like what is that going to look like? What are some evidence-based approaches we can take? And when I say evidence-based, I mean, what is the research telling us? And then collaboration and training, providing opportunities to have these discussions, to let families know that this is how the experience might be impacting them, because everyone is going to be different. And addressing toxic stress. So toxic stress is showing up again. We talked about that early on in the series, which toxic stress is, everyone has stress. There's the good stress, which is what we sort of need to thrive on. Everybody has it. There's the bad stress, which is like, might be an episode of stress, but it's like, feels very oppressive. It feels like unsurmountable, like we're not going to get past it. And then there's toxic stress, which is literally toxic, right? And so how we can address it in this space, again, and I keep saying it, is promoting awareness, because I think that's the lowest hanging fruit right now, is how can we begin to have those conversations? How can we have those bold conversations? And how can we assess how this is showing up for our children who are experiencing ACEs in our community? And part of this too is a movement by the health community in certain parts of our country to incorporate screeners for adverse childhood experiences into well child visits. And how can we provide space for trauma-informed guidance for parents who don't understand or may not have the ability to think about how has this showed up for them generation after generation after generation. You know, oftentimes as they have an opportunity to take a breath and think like, well, what are the origins of how I got here? Guidance, targeting and tailoring services, and then developing an awareness and knowledge of life experiences. And this is a new term I actually came across today. It was called ACEs Knowing. I was a doctor on one of the panels, and I was like, I really like that, ACEs Knowing. Same thing, trauma informed, right? You are developing an awareness of how those life experiences impact the child. And so helping parents shows up by giving them the space and the opportunity to rewrite their narrative. Once they have this knowledge, how can they use it and become it for different outcomes for their child, where there are opportunities for that to come from. Build emotional control, mindfulness, and true collaboration. We heard about, you know, offering meditation services targeted at the communities we've been discussing this evening. And then understanding the lived experiences. I mean, I cannot underscore enough how important validation and empathy are, much like they were in other spaces we talked about throughout the series, but those are true things that get at the heart of humanity. And so I'll end things with this quote from Dr. Nadine Burke Harris. And I'm sure you all, some of you might have heard me talk about her before, but she is a phenomenal advocate and researcher in this space. She's the California Attorney General. And she said, the hardest part of the job is sitting in proximity to so much harm and suffering and sitting there long enough to be a difference. And I was like, wow, no truer words have been spoken. I could apply that quote in like so many different aspects of my life. And so I think for me, how that shows up is, you know, resting, sitting with the questions, sitting with the discomfort and the uncomfortableness about this sort of inner exploration, but doing so that progress can be made. So those are the fancy references. I think